All right. All right. Awesome, guys. Name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So each week we've been looking at biblical insights and practical applications for how it is that we handle living in this sacred world with a sacred worldview in the secular society that's around us. And for today's topic, we're going to be looking specifically at the third one, consumerism. We started with materialism. We said that first week that in a secular worldview, all that is the material world, right? All that is the material world. There's no spiritual world. There's no angels and saints. There's no God. There's nothing in a purely secular world that doesn't exist. Now, in Christian secularism, and I know that sounds like contradictory to one another, right? But in Christian secularism, there's a belief, by the way, that there's a God, but he's somewhere out there, way out there, right? He's nowhere really involved in our lives. He kind of set things in motion, and we know that sometimes he intervenes, but he's not really here, right? And so that first week we spoke quite a bit about this idea that God is with his angels and saints, are around us, are present with us, and that we're in the midst of this spiritual warfare. And but thanks be to God, he is here and he covers us and he sends us not just, the Father doesn't just send us the Son, but he fills us with his Spirit. He sends us angels. And so we are in the midst of this spiritual reality. Then last week we talked about individualism, how it is that people want to construct their own sense of self-identity, who they are, and what that ultimately leads to is each one even crafting their own sense of their religion, right? This is my religion, this is what I believe to be true, right? And so this is kind of, you can see this across the secular, and I'm going to say the American secular landscape, since that's where we live. You can see this in the American secular landscape, where even I would say a lot of folks who are raised in the Orthodox Church have just kind of said, well, I like those things about the church, but I don't agree with those 3 things or those 4 things, or and it's kind of like you start having this syncretistic formation of an individual or personal faith, right? So that was last week. Today we're going to jump into consumerism. And I think this is where it starts tugging a little bit more on the inside. This is where, if you will, if I could take you back to the garden, where we look, we see, we desire, we want, we have to consume. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6 to 7. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Keywords that jump out to you guys? Any keywords from this verse that stand out? Saw that it was good, right? There's consuming doesn't always begin with taking, right? It starts with the eyes, right? So that's really important. We look at something, we see it, right? And we see that it was good. What else? What are the words? Desirable, right? So sometimes you see something with your eyes and you're like, but then sometimes you see something with your eyes and you desire it, you want it, right? It may be a thing, it may be a person, it may be a food, right? But it's this desire to consume something, to have it. It's desirable, right? Any other words that jump out? It was pleasant to the eyes. It was pleasant. It looked good. It looked good. And then the last one that's really key is she took it, right? She took it, and interestingly, she didn't just take it for herself, but she also wanted her husband to consume, right? So in a consumerist, secular society, it's not just that I want to consume, I want to create a society where everyone, all they do is they seek to consume. They seek to have and take whatever it is that they want. Now, before we jump into the talk, I want to share kind of like a really interesting story that I was not familiar with myself up until this past summer. It's an account called the Sash of St. Mary. Is anyone familiar with this? Okay, so this is a tradition that is more familiar in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. But the tradition basically says that at the Dormition of the Theotokos, when she passed, she was buried by the 12 apostles in Jerusalem, and 3 days later, St. Thomas the Apostle asked to have one last look at the Virgin Mary. When he and the other apostles arrived at the tomb, they found that her body was missing. According to some accounts, the Virgin Mary appeared to them at that time. Some accounts say that she gave them her belt, like a red sash belt. Others say that the sash fell as she was being assumed into heaven, right? Now, I share this story because there's different reactions that people have to this story. The first is the secularist. The secularist would hear that story and say, oh, that's just silly. That's a silly thing. What does it mean that a saint would appear and offer something to another person, right? That's the secularist. And there's a little bit of that skeptic secularism in us, in some of us, right? That we hear these sorts of things and we're like, that's ridiculous. Then there's the consumer. Actually, let me skip the consumer. Let me come to the opposite, which is the eschatist, or the one who has more an eschatological view of the world. And that person says, that event reminds me that heaven has broken into this world, right? They're not shocked by that. When they hear about a saint appearing or God appearing to a person, or like, they're not shocked by those sorts of things. They hear about an icon dripping with oil, they're like, yeah, okay, like those things don't surprise them, right? When they hear that God offers himself in the form of bread and wine, that becomes his body and his blood by the act of the Holy Spirit, these things don't shock that person, right? They hear those things and they're like, yeah, heaven has broken in. God was incarnate. He entered into our world. But then there's the consumerist. The consumerist says, if I can just kiss the sash, it'll make me holier. If I can just touch it, it'll do something. It's all about, I need to consume and have. And that kind of consumerist mentality, by the way, is very prevalent with people that are like, they might accept that other category of being an eschatist. Someone says, yeah, like heaven is broken in, but they don't stop there. They want to consume, and they see this voracious appetite to just take, right? And I just need to get it, and if I consume it, it'll do something for me. So let's jump now a little bit deeper into secular consumerism, and then we'll come back to some of these things as well. All right, so secular consumerism focuses on acquiring material possessions and experiences. It's not just about eating or having possessions, right? Consumerism is about, there's an experience, I have to have it. I have to jump out of an airplane. I have to do the trip around the world before my 50th birthday, right? I have to take that 1 year and go on, maybe not 50th, maybe after I retire, right? I mean, there are things that I must consume to make me feel a sense of accomplishment or fullness. Sometimes these things include material goods. Sometimes they're status symbols, okay? Acquiring material possessions for the secularist is a means of achieving happiness, satisfaction, and fulfillment. Without these sorts of things, life is just not good. Life is empty. It's not restricted to the necessities of life, as we heard earlier, a number of you mentioned, but it also usually concentrates on the excesses of life, those extra things that we don't really need, but it's like, I gotta have it because it'll give me a place of status and make me feel like now I can show face in front of others. And it can come oftentimes, guys, with a great and heavy expense. Not just a financial expense, but it can come at the expense of relationships with others. And it oftentimes also accompanies the expense of spiritual growth. Now, we've got to remember, as a number of you said, and as our marketing professional back there or had mentioned to us, like there's a science that's there, and there's a lot of money that's being thrown into shaping us to be consumers, right? There's science that's studied, right? What does this do with this group, there's data points. You are not just a person, you're a data point, right? All your search histories are kind of being brought in. Where you live matters, obviously, in this. So the question is, how can I get these people to consume a little more and make them feel like if they just have this, it's desirable to the eyes, then they're going to feel good. A few weeks ago, we had probably the largest marketing event in the history each year that happens, right? Every year. The largest marketing event is Super Bowl. Anyone remember how much ads were this year? $7 million. $7 million. By the way, this is the reported advertising revenue from 2003 to 2023, and just see how that chart continues to grow, right? In 2003, the revenue that was generated was $130 million. This last year, I don't know what this year's numbers are, it was $600 million of advertising revenue from just that few hours. I mean, that is mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing, right? The amount of money that's being poured into getting us to consume by these corporations and influencers and whatnot, it's astronomical. Let's talk a little bit more about the effects of consumerism. I've got 4 for you, and this is not an exhaustive list. The first one, there tends to be a prioritization of immediate gratification, right? You prioritize, I need it now. And what that develops and forms within a person is the need to always have what it is, what they need, right then and there. There's no ability for that consumerist to delay gratification. It can lead to this cycle of constantly buying new things and oftentimes returning them, right? When you're like, I really just don't think I need this. Or it goes into the closet or into the basement where, you know, it's like, you pass the 30-day window, which, by the way, that 30-day window is not really firm, I've learned, okay? But nonetheless, like, you realize you're like, I got to return it. I can't return it. Maybe I'll re-gift it to someone. I don't really need it. But that need for always purchasing and instant gratification, it oftentimes leads to this feeling of never being satisfied. I've just never got enough. I need the next thing to make me feel a little bit better. The second thing that it leads to is a dissatisfaction and low self-esteem. And you might look and say, like, really? Like low self-esteem? And the answer is yeah, because if I need things to make me feel esteemed, then the need to constantly consume and acquire things to make me feel esteemed will lead to me feeling that I have a low self-esteem. It'll help me, like, it'll cause me to look at myself less than. It'll cause me to be dissatisfied with who I am, in and of who I am created as the image of God. We oftentimes also begin to compare ourselves to others. Well, they've got that car, I've got to get one too, right? Or I've got to one-up them. We've always trying to keep up with the Joneses and just have a little bit more. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10 says, whoever loves money never has enough. Isn't that true? Whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. And then this man who is the richest man who ever lived says, this too is meaningless, right? Guys, consuming, acquiring, it's like it'll never be enough. It'll always lead to more and more dissatisfaction. The third effect is overconsumption and waste. We realize, we're like, why did I get that? We were just talking yesterday at our foundations course about, we got sushi for dinner. It was wonderful, it was delicious. And then someone said, oh, you know, like, I don't even remember who it was, but they were talking about all-you-can-eat sushi. And I'm like, I just can't go anymore. I can't do it. And I was like, every time I go, I'm like, I overeat. And then what happens is, because you got to get your money's worth, right? You're a consumer. You have to get your money's worth. And so then what happens after that, you're like, oh, you walk out, you're like, I hate sushi, I'm never having it again. I'm not gonna eat sushi for like, oh, I got one person back there like, nope, I'm going back next week, okay? Well, for myself, when I overconsume, or for me, the other one is like a bag of Doritos. If I open up that bag of Doritos and I'm like 10 pieces in, I just can't stop, right? And then you keep going, and you keep going, and if you're working on stuff, and we heard it earlier, stress eating, or you're just like, it's comfort food, and I could go through half a bag of one of those super big Costco bags, and it's like, what did I just do to myself, right? And there's so much waste, not to mention the stomach aches as well. The fourth one rather, and actually before I jump off of that one, obviously guys, with the overconsumption and waste, we can talk about our own personal waste. There's also a lot of environmental waste. There's a lot of waste that, like, I think how much trash we create as a society and how much environmental waste that there is. I won't go too deep into the EV conversation, but one of the things that people keep talking about, they're like, well, yes, we got renewable energies and all this sort of stuff, but then the people that oftentimes ask the question, what happens to the batteries? They've not found a good way to dispose of the batteries, right? There's a lot of environmental waste that's out there, right? I'm not going to say that the other side, this isn't like this one's good, this one's bad, but there's so much waste that is destroying the world that we, by the way, are called by God to steward, to take care of, right? This isn't a political thing, this is a theological thing, that God has entrusted this world to us and said, you take care of it. Right? So the fourth one is, I believe it does create a culture of debt. Now, some people can be confronted that I don't have a whole lot right now and I'm going to make some different decisions. But then there are those who just keep on buying. They put on credit. And then they overspend. I remember when Maura and I first got married. Our realtor was trying to sell us a house, showed us a bunch of different houses, and I said, I think this one is good for us. And Maura was like, yeah, I think that meets not just our need today, but I mean, it'll give us a little bit more for the future. This was before we had any thought we were moving to New York for after ordination. And the realtor, I'll never forget, he said, oh, but you can afford so much more. Like, I see your W-2s. You can afford a much bigger house. And I just remember saying, maybe, but I don't want to live in debt my whole life. I don't want to just continue to consume so that I can continue to acquire more and more debt. And this consumerist culture wants to keep us enslaved. In the Garden of Eden, it was be enslaved that led to an enslavement of sin. But in the world that we live in today, it can lead to enslavement of sin, but it can also just lead to an enslavement to debt, right? And that you can never climb out of that hole. And that is one of the most difficult things that people live within, is that they will just put it on credit and accrue more and more and more and more debt just to continue to maintain that cycle of consumption they've gotten used to. And it never satisfies. Let's shift a little bit and talk about consumerism in American Christianity. There's a Harvard Business Review study that I came across probably about 15 years ago. You guys are familiar with the Harvard School of Business, I'm assuming. They have a business review journal, an academic journal that they put out quarterly. At the time, at least, it was quarterly. And they had done a study on a church called Willow Creek Community Church right outside of Chicago. And they interviewed for that business review the head pastor at the time. His name is Bill Hybels. He's still there. And it was really interesting. When they interviewed him, they got to talking to him. They assessed something really powerful that most people miss over, which is his model of church was a consumerist model, was a business model. It was a sales and marketing model, right? And so he spoke really clearly that he sees parishioners as customers. And he wants to provide the best customer service for them. And so he says if we do like a study and realize the color of the paint on the wall is not what's drawing people in, we'll repaint it. We'll repaint the entire building, right? And if we walk into the bathroom and we notice something, it was really focused on this consumerist model. We have to make sure that we are creating a church environment that is good for the consumer. Because what he said was, if they don't like what they find here, they're going to go to the next place, right? And that is the epitome of consumerism, guys. That is it. He talked about music and how they use music in order to speak to the emotional desires and needs of the people who attend. Now, I've got a friend lives in the West Coast. Him and his wife are adult converts to the Coptic church. They stumbled into a Coptic church one day in West Covina, California. And I remember him sharing a couple stories that I'll just share with you on this. First thing he said was, when he walked into the church, he noticed like nobody spoke to him. And he said, that was actually really refreshing. He said, I didn't have 15 people greeting me. He said, I just got to walk into church, and I wasn't the focus as the one that was a consumer, the customer. God was the focus. He said, I actually loved that. I appreciated it very much. And then the second thing he said is that the priest stopped, and he says, introduced himself. He said, why don't you stay for a little bit? And if you like it, after they had an exchange, he said, if you like it, then, we'll continue. And he looked at him. This is in the middle of service. He goes, Father, whether I like it or not is completely irrelevant. If it's true, if it's right, but I don't like it, then I've got to submit to it. But if I really like it, and it makes me feel good, but if it's not true, I'm out of this place. Right? And that was like really sober-minded of him to be able to think that, to express it. Because he had gone through life for so long being seen as a customer that needed to consume that he's like, I can't continue doing this. Now, let me share with you a little bit about his background. And he shared these stories publicly, so I'm not sharing anyone's confession, okay? But him and his wife used to be really involved with a very specific evangelical church in Crystal Springs, I believe it is, California. It's like they call it the Crystal Cathedral. And he would share stories with me how his job, his role there was, he calls it to run seating. Okay, so he was like the main head greeter person. And he shared with me, he goes, I was so like broken at some point when I looked in church and I realized this consumerist model that existed in these churches I was attending. He said, Father, do you realize that they would form the program each week in such a way to manipulate the people? I'm like, what do you mean? He said, they would open with a specific song. They would then move to a second song, and that second song would be a little bit more emotional. He said they would usually have a few people planted in different parts of the church, of the auditorium, that would start crying. Right? And they were planted, he said. He said for sure there were some people, maybe that they were genuinely moved by the Spirit, but what happened is those people, other people around them would start crying, and then the basket would start getting passed around, right? The envelopes would start getting passed. He's like, it was so manipulative. I lost trust. And he said for a certain point, him and his wife actually left. I think they left church altogether. And then, anyway, by the grace of God, he brought them back into a right relationship with him. There's a lot of studies that have been done. I don't want to critique every evangelical church out there and say that they're all like that, because I'm sure that there are some that are not, okay? But if you want to read more on this, there's a really interesting book called Evangelicals Incorporated. I think the guy's name is Daniel Vaca. He talks quite a bit about this sort of stuff, okay? You will notice in the Orthodox Church, there's not really that sort of focus, right? We are not trying to move or emotionally manipulate people during service in any respect. So anyway, I would encourage you I'll try to find the case study for those who are interested, but really, really fascinating stuff, guys, really interesting. So let's talk about how this kind of distorted view of faith caused by consumerism, how it trickles down and how does it affect people. And before we think I'm just talking about what can happen out there, I'm talking specifically about how that consumerist mindset can seep into church for us, okay? I'm not talking about the evangelical church. I'm talking about us now, home, okay? Church. The first is that we can turn spirituality into a market commodity, right? A market commodity is something to be taken, something I need to get this thing to help me do this thing, right? I have a job interview, so I must take communion on Sunday because my interview is Monday, right? So it sees this beautiful gift of grace that's intended to transform and heal us as something that I have to acquire because I need something in return. Does that make sense? Okay. One of the interesting things for me is the biggest day of the year in the Coptic Church is Palm Sunday. You know why that is? People want to be sprinkled with water at the end, lest they die during Pascha week, right? Maybe people also really love the hymns. I love the hymns of Pascha, right? But it's about, I need to get this thing to make me feel I'm secure, I'm safe. If something bad happens, then I'll be just fine, okay? The second one is that spiritual success is equated with more. Spiritual success is equated with more. If you're doing well financially, that's because God is blessing you, and because God is blessing you, that means that you're doing well spiritually. That's what this notion says. Which says what? Those who are not doing well financially, God is not blessing them, right? This is total prosperity theology. This is a complete distortion, guys. The third one is liturgical reduction. Consumerism says, I'll just go to liturgy once a month. That's all I need, right? I'll just go to liturgy. I'll check the box once a month. I'll kind of tithe. I'll confess once a year. I'll do just enough to check the boxes, to consume the things that I need to consume so that I can be fine and okay by God, right? So these are ways that it kind of creeps into us. All right, let's wrap up here. We've been talking about how can we maintain a faith-centered life within a secular society. And our verse that we're going to keep coming back to throughout the entire series is this passage in Psalm 24, and all its fullness. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. There is no place, there is no thing that is not God's. There's nothing in life that is not, that is not given from God, that cannot satisfy and fill us and satisfy our true and deep longing and desire. But in order for us to experience that, we've got to be prepared to navigate this constant consumption, this culture that we live in. And I just want to wrap up with 5 quick points on this. How do we do this? The first is that we have to set our hearts on heaven. Set your heart on heaven. Understand, guys, that consuming, if you have everything that there is, as Solomon said, vanity of vanities. It'll never be enough. I promise you. Promise you. There's a reason why, by the way, during seasons of fasting, when you go towards minimalism, right? And you kind of even look at your own life and you're like, what am I living for? That you find yourself just a little bit more satisfied, right? It's always interesting to me when people have near-death experiences and then they reset their whole lives on heaven, on God, the sort of satisfaction that it gives them in life, the sort of fulfillment that they have by living in light of the kingdom of God rather than trying to build up a kingdom and consume everything here. Lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6:20 and 21. The second one is embrace delay for eternal gratification. Embrace delay. You want it now, and God is saying, why don't you wait? Why don't you just put it off? Okay? I think as we get ready for Lent in 2 weeks, I know we've got Jonah's fast tomorrow. It's a 3-day, it's a short one. But as we get ready for tomorrow, I want you to look ahead also to Lent. And I want you to think for Lent, there's going to be times where you're going to be like, but I really want to eat this. I really want a hamburger, right? I really want a piece of steak. And you're going to tell me, like, does God really care if I have some cheese? The God-honest answer, no, he doesn't. He doesn't. You're not fasting to do something to him. When you fast, God is looking at you and saying, this person is hungering, and they're delaying gratification. They're putting off this desire to constantly consume. Let my grace continue to work in this person. Okay? But we just want to consume all the time. Right? So delay this need for instant gratification, seeking that which is eternal, hungering for God's presence amongst us. Number 3 is live Eucharistically. Live Eucharistically. During the materialist talk, we said to offer to God all that you have, right? To live Eucharistically within a consumerist mindset that we're surrounded by. The word Eucharist also is not just offering things back to God, but it's specifically offering thanks back to God. Yep. So if you're to live Eucharistically, you're saying to God, I thank you for everything that I have. I am satisfied. My cup is full from you. I'm living Eucharistically. Number 4, live today in light of eternity. Live today in light of not the goal we want for tomorrow, but in light of the eternal life that's prepared for us after this life. 1 Timothy 6, verse 6-8 says, now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. Let me say that again. We brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out with us. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. Okay? Live today in light of eternity. And number 5 is guard your heart to live beyond possessions. Be watchful, because there's a whole science and there's a whole psychology that's there, and there's a whole marketing system that's there that's trying to get you to just keep on going back, right? And yep, sometimes it's the devil himself tempting you, and sometimes it's his minions, and sometimes it's just this good old consumerist society that we live in, this secular world that we live in. Luke 12, verse 15. I want to wrap up with this final verse for you. Jesus said to them, watch out, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Life doesn't consist in abundance of possessions. But he said to them, be on guard. Be watchful. Be watchful against all kinds of greed, right? So guard your heart to live beyond this desire for possessions and experiences, because there's so much more that God is offering to us. The God who is present with us, the God who dwells with us, the God who fills your heart, the God who fills your life, he's the one who can satisfy you. He's the one who will fill you. He's the one who will give you a heart and a life of thanksgiving. Next week, we're going to shift to the 4th talk, which is actually in 2 weeks. We'll shift to the 4th talk about relativism and how it is in this secular society we have to wrestle with the moral ambiguity that exists.